Hi everyone, this is a Patreon video and one of my patrons has commissioned six videos. So I'm going to make 6 quality investigative videos on his topics. This is fun and I'm grateful. If you want me to make a video asking me to research a topic, I'll do it for $100 into PayPal or Patreon. Thanks. So the question for this video is basically, the ancient city of Tiwanaku, Bolivia, had a port with no existing body of water. Do you think the port was for a larger Lake Titicaca that is larger than today, which is also a saltwater lake at high altitude? Or do you think the whole region raised up in altitude due to some isostatic glaciation shift in tectonic plates or something else? And straight off the bat, I have to tell you, that's a very interesting question because there are many saltwater lakes in the mountains around the world, and these have traditionally been held to be relics of the flood. Lakes in Turkey, lakes in Syria, lakes in the Caucasus contain salt water high in the mountains. People don't quite know why. So let's get into this video. So thank you. Now, please be patient with me, sir. I will get to all 6 of your videos, all 6 of your questions, and I'll research them to my satisfaction. So, I used to think that the entire Altiplano region did indeed once shift upwards, as stated by Arthur Posnansky in the early 20th century. I still think there is some possibility for this, but I now tend to think it didn't happen, but also that it could have happened. There is nothing impossible. In our conventional archaeology of 2021 AD, Tiahuanacu rose as a civilization and empire in the time of Christ, and it is said to have lasted for 1,000 years. It was a city of 10 to 20,000 controlling a large empire. Its people made ceramics, textiles, ate fish, birds, plants, and animals such as the camelids and llamas. It controlled other areas, possibly as a trading empire. This conventional view of Tiahuanacu arose shortly after Arthur Posnansky's death in 1946, because what happened was suddenly the first radiocarbon dates started to appear and they placed the empire around the time of Christ. Now, this point of view wasn't always the case, because in prior decades it was once thought that Tiahuanacu was far more ancient. Evidence was seen at the site of some kind of cataclysm, interpreted as a cataclysm, but now put down to political upheaval, such as, say, the broken gate of the sun. Now, why might Posnansky have at one time thought that there was an upheaval here? So let's look at the climate. If we look at the temperature at Tiahuanacu, we see it's at present rather cool. It's a rather cool 16 degrees Celsius in the day, or 60 Fahrenheit, and getting close to freezing at night time. So it's frosty. So this is a high altitude capital of a former empire. But why shouldn't we have high altitude capitals? For example, Bogota, Colombia is like this, 13 million people, at an altitude of 2,644 meters, cold all year round, versus Tiahuanacu's 3,850 meters. So if frosty temperatures are why Posnansky thought the area must have been uplifted, this may not have been a good enough reason for thinking so. The area seems to have been perfectly fine for growing potatoes, beans, maize, and quinoa. I must warn people against inaccurate information found online. For example, it is said that Posnansky noted no rain on the Altiplano Plateau, and so assumed the place must have been very different in Tiahuanacu's heyday. But it needs to be qualified that Tiahuanacu is not quite on this plateau, and Tiahuanacu is probably more a part of the Titicaca Basin, where there is abundant rainfall and farming is fine. So let's be clear what we mean when we talk about the idea of a sudden uplift being responsible for the elevated location of Tiahuanacu, as I've noticed some confusion into the reasons why this theory was being advocated in the ancient mystery community. So it was the adventurous archaeologist and entrepreneur Posnansky who possibly first noticed or claimed this. He claimed that Tiwanaku seemed to be a port city with no water nearby, and he wanted to investigate why. So what happened was he actually claimed that 12,000 years ago, Tiwanaku was much closer to sea level, and he claimed it had a semi-tropical climate. Now, Posnansky could not envisage people living in this climate. It seemed a little too inhospitable to him, but how much more inhospitable must it have been 12,000 years ago if there was no uplift at the end of the Ice Age? Now these days, the idea of a port city in the mountains is kind of odd because we associate a port with sea level, yet Tiahuanacu seems to be at the elevation of 3,850 meters. This introduces the first level of confusion, as it is assumed Tiahuanacu was once on the coast or on a river, hence the need for elevation, but there is no need for uplift as the port was presumably on Lake Titicaca, which is at a slightly lower elevation, 800 feet lower than Tiahuanacu, but 20 kilometers away. And no rivers flow from Titicaca, so it is assumed that the lake has shrunk due to evaporation, though it probably once lapped around Tiahuanacu, according to archaeologists. And archaeologists also say the apparent harbours and docks found at Tiahuanacu, now they've got some different explanations. Some say the lake went up to the city. Some say in previous generations, they say, look, they tried to throw out everything that Posnansky claimed. So they said, oh, they're ritual ports, they're ritual harbours. And the city wasn't even inhabited, it was a ritual city. But these days, it is acknowledged by archaeologists to have been the seat of an empire, just as Posnansky claimed. So we cannot then claim that Posnansky's claims have been discredited because he was truly actually a pioneer of today's thinking. But if this is all true and the lake has receded, then why are there actual ruins, an actual city underneath the current Lake Titicaca, as is becoming apparent in the last few decades? Something really weird is going on. Could the lake really have such terrible variability over thousands of years or literally 1,000 years? The Tiwanaku people are called the Aymara, which Tor Heyerdahl noted sounds like Amara, a city in Egypt and also Iraq. And so these people may have communicated with tribes of the old world, or they may have been those tribes. So they may have suddenly appeared from nowhere after some migration, we don't know when. So they may have simply been settlers at the area more recently than 12,000 years ago and not necessarily uplifted. According to a paper called The Mystery of Tiwanaku, digitized in 2003 and compiled from various books, ruins are found 6 feet below the present ground surface. There is no apparent way for the ruins to have been covered to this level, as there is no runoff at the site from higher peaks, as there is no rain on those peaks, and therefore nothing to carry soil with it. As there is a lake nearby, downhill, there is no reason to argue the city was uplifted from sea level. Lake Titicaca was enormous and full of fish. In the Tiwanaku port areas, it is noted that rocks nearby ruins display yellow-white calcareous deposit showing prehistoric water levels at the city. It is written in the 2003 paper that I'm quoting from that the calcite line of this water level is strangely tilted and not horizontal, indicating some ground upheaval had taken place. Perhaps there was even ocean upheaval. Part of the reason for supposing an upheaval seems to be that Lake Titicaca itself contains ocean life, such as marine mollusks. Why would that be the case? It is also saltwater like an ocean, and it contains both fossilized as well as current ocean creatures. In addition, the original shoreline seems much higher in one place than another, despite seemingly equal elevation. This all indicates that there has indeed been an upheaval, which we can geologically detect. But was it a recent one? And that's the problem, because the evidence doesn't seem to indicate that. Or if it does, we are simply lacking enough data from which to derive such evidence either way. You see, judging from the map, it seems that Tiahuanacu is 200 miles from the Pacific Ocean, and this is a huge problem for talk about recent upheaval. It is furthermore separated from the ocean by even taller mountains of Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. If some cataclysm occurred recently, that would mean that enormous areas of mountain range are also recent, something I just cannot believe, as science does not indicate this just yet. There are supposedly ruined docks and piers which are quite large, which would have allowed hundreds of ships to dock, found at Tiwanaku. And what is some more evidence for geological upheaval? So we know that the 10-ton solar gateway was found broken, evidence of a cataclysm according to Posnansky, or maybe it was just broken up by people who had clearly looted the site, trying to take away everything over thousands and thousands of years, or just 1,000 years if we accept what the archaeologists claim. So we see there are different ways of interpreting the evidence. So my patron asked me what I think about the upheaval theory and what might have caused it. So here we go. So straight off the bat, mountain formation seems to have happened in remote periods, too remote it is said for human beings to consider. There is another more conventional possibility. In his question to me, my patron noted the possibility of something I had not considered called isostatic glaciation shift. Basically, when a glacier moves, being very heavy, or it vanishes, or it breaks away, or whatever happens, the ground around it moves and rebounds in some way. That can explain much of which has been covered so far in this video. I'd also say that stones showing skewed out of horizontal sea levels in terms of calcite markings on them could be triggered by either the isostatic rebound or the fact they've been recycled. Perhaps even recycled from earlier structures, we don't really know. And these Victorian era men of the world would spend a lot of time publishing multi-volume works, and Posnansky did so at his own expense. Thus, Posnansky's final work was a 4-volume compendium, the first 2 volumes published in 1945 and the second 2 in 1957. In this we see Posnansky's final argument based on decades of work. He claimed that Tiahuanacu was constructed in about 15,000 BC. Now clearly this gives us a lot of even geological time to work with. Posnansky saw this city as the original metropolis of American civilization. Due to the massive size of the blocks dragged from 10 miles away, I believe the Tiwanaku people may have had massive libraries, a massive population and a great education system. Posnansky noted that the Tiwanaku ruins seem to have been covered by a very thin layer of lime deposit, showing that they had been underwater for quite some time. In other words, the lake was bigger in Tiwanaku's time, just after the fall of Tiwanaku. It was then covered by the lake. So one is reminded of the dramatic changes in the Aral Sea caused by cotton agriculture in the late 20th century. And something that Posnansky noticed was that other ruins were actually deeply buried in sediments. So not only did the lake cover the ruins, but sediments covered the ruins. Something happened, a wave crashing over or something. So he started to assume that there was a tremendous wave of water, maybe a tsunami, possibly something smacking into the surface of the lake, and I imagine drowning everyone in the city. But I'm unsure if Posnansky was aware of the tsunami phenomenon. Posnansky also noted there is no rain on the higher plateau, so there was nothing to sweep down the mountains, sweep soil down the mountains, so only a wave from the lake, perhaps Lake Titicaca, could have done it. So he actually suggested that a sudden biblical flood was responsible. And that didn't do much for his credibility, apparently. Now, apparently the tilt of Earth's axis, as indicated by an alignment of the Kalasasaya temple, provides a date of 15,000 BC, which is interesting because the author of the paper I'm quoting from suggests that Posnansky's catastrophe is one and the same as the Pleistocene-ending catastrophe. You look at the date of 15,000 BC, you think of the Younger Dryas 13,000 years ago, and which was a sudden cooling in the midst of a warming, triggering the Holocene, a warm period, and we don't know what caused it. Was it volcanoes, earthquakes, comets? We don't know, but we know that everyone has a theory, and that theory is different from everyone else's theories. So, could the Tiwanaku people have once made use of their ports? Did they sail plentiful ships on Lake Titicaca? Certainly, why not? Such a thing was possible, and it didn't have to be at sea level. This is just so interesting. I really do admire Posnansky's 50 years of work on the site. I believe he was onto something. I'm not sure about his archaeoastronomical dates. Those dates, you can, if you're not aware of certain astronomical issues, certain things that happen, you can easily mess up with archaeoastronomy, so you have to be cautious. Now, many of the fanciful pictures you see on Google images relating to Tiahuanacu, as it supposedly was, are not from books by Posnansky, but for instance those of his followers or from newspaper articles, and his followers include ancient astronaut theorist Hans Schindler Bellamy, who wrote Before the Flood, The Problem of the Tiahuanacu Ruins, 1943. According to Atlantipedia, Hans Schindler Bellamy, who may or may not have been an Englishman, may be a pseudonym of Rudolf Elmayer von Festenbruck, also known as Elmar Bruck. He perhaps wanted to have an English pen name, it seems, and the photo credit is from Atlantipedia. I hope they don't mind. The University of La Paz awarded Bellamy and his co-author Alan an honorary professorship for their work. Now, Bellamy, Bruck, or whatever his name was, believed that the Earth's year was once literally 290 days in length. And it changed because of a catastrophe. Now, he believed that this faster year was caused by a pre-moon orbiting closer and closer to the Earth, eventually crashing into our Earth, triggering this once rapid rotation. This 290-day year he deduced from the Gate of the Sun and other monuments, and he placed this theory in a book he entitled The Calendar of Tiahuanacu, published in 1956. Bruck or Bellamy, like Posnansky, believed in a vast antiquity, claiming that Tiahuanacu reached back 12,000 years. Bellamy, like other Germans of the war generation, believed in ice catastrophism, that is, World Ice Doctrine. It's actually a very interesting theory that appears to make sense if you get into it and ignore other theories. The idea is that Earth keeps acquiring moons over its geological history, which spiral down into Earth, crashing into it and assimilating, thus being a precursor for expanding Earth theory. Ice catastrophism, an official theory of Germany's wartime government, or semi-official, advocated that the solar system was mostly made of ice, except for the sun, and that the moon, also being ice, you can tell by its colour, would periodically crash into Earth. And then we would acquire a new moon. This accorded with dreams Bellamy had as a child, so he admired these ice theories of Professor Horbiger in Germany. So Bellamy recounted to people that as a child he would awaken in fear with a sick feeling of déjà vu, which became especially pressing when he observed the moon through a telescope, and he recalled the details of his dreams, then reading the same things in the World Ice Doctrine. So the ice catastrophists also held that the Milky Way was made of ice, and it was an explosion caused by a waterlogged star crashing into another massive star, resulting in the Milky Way. So if there was an upheaval, thought Bellamy, it was caused by the ice moon. Bellamy continued this line of thinking despite Germany's losing World War II and therefore such ideas as theirs being discredited. Now, I personally don't see enough evidence for upheaval at Tiahuanacu, merely for minor events such as earthquakes possibly, and we know inland seas can rapidly change in size, so maybe we shouldn't put too much emphasis on the upheaval theory. But if it did rapidly change in size, like the Aral Sea we mentioned earlier, and if the area was uplifted, I can think of some ways in which this might have occurred. Maybe some unconventional ways. So the following is my little theory. You don't have to believe it. It's up to you. I don't mind. So my major idea would be along the lines of expanding Earth, which I'll expand into an idea called shrinking Earth, and this is suddenly rapidly occurring. So I proposed a new theory about a year or two ago called sudden shrinking Earth theory, and I believe this is what is described in the Bible. Let me explain. Back at university, I had a great professor called Ian Plimmer. Maybe you've heard of him. And he said in a recent interview that he believes that in future, our geological thinking will be a combination of plate tectonics and expanding Earth. So if the Earth is expanding, and I think that engineers can back me up on this, and I think that astronomers might be able to back me up on this, due to the variability in the size of stars, which we know occurs, the sudden shifting and changes of stars, changing in the size of objects in the sky, well, might the Earth not do the same thing based on the same foundation laws of the universe? Might the Earth not suddenly alter in size based on whatever is happening inside the Earth? And we don't quite know what is happening inside the Earth. We're saying, yes, it's nuclear. We've got all our theories. They seem solid, but I tell you what, Lord Kelvin's theories in the 19th century also seemed absolutely solid, despite all the geologists saying we need at least 1.5 billion years to explain Earth's changes. And the physicists said, no, 20 million years is all you need. You guys exaggerate too much. And the physicists held the day until suddenly radiocarbon came out and boom, the geologists were proven correct. Lord Kelvin was wrong. So you can't rationalize catastrophism if you're using the wrong physics. So that's why I've hypothesized a new kind of mechanism where the inside of the planet is actually a kind of star. And the same system, stars, the interiors of planets, perhaps galaxies, perhaps atoms, perhaps orbs, perhaps UFOs, being, according to Alan Hynek, the Blue Book guy, and usually something that looks like an orange beach ball. Ball lightnings, maybe even atoms, maybe even electrons, protons, neutrons, all of them the same kind of spherical system, the same system at work. Why do we need an independent mechanism for every single spherical-like, orb-like system? And I even wrote an article about this, and I believe the electric universe theorists have a similar theory going on, where everything is just changing energy, but the same thing across space and across time. So I hypothesize if the Earth is a kind of star and with a garbage layer floating on top, it can shrink in size, it can change in size. And if it suddenly does change in size, boom, we can explain some ancient mysteries. For example, I've noticed that the Earth's year always used to have less days in ancient calendars, but never more than 365 days. So it always had less years, but it never had more years. Do you notice that? So by shrinking the size of the Earth, you maintain a spin momentum over a small spin area. This means faster days or more days, which is fascinating. So by expanding the Earth's calendar to 365 days, you could do that by shrinking the Earth. Now, you can believe whatever you want to, but I seriously believe that if expanding Earth is true, which it seems to be, then shrinking Earth must also be true too. And this actually occurred to me, this theory sort of occurred to me when I read in the Quran that the waters of the deep came out of the ground. And I thought, well, that's interesting. They didn't come from the sky. They came out of the ground. So to get the water out of the ground, you would shrink the Earth. When you shrink the Earth, you would elevate the mountains, elevate the plateaus. You could compress a valley into a mountain. Maybe a local valley was compressed into a mountain. And I love this explanation because it's what the Bible says. I prefer it to the weird idea of a comet impact Comets, of course, being very low density, having somehow enough energy to evaporate a massive area of ice. Then that ice rains down into a massive flood elsewhere, because to me, this would seem to create little net difference in ocean levels because the Earth is the same size. Sure, you're taking the water off the land into the water, but where is the net change? The net change can only occur when you change the size of the Earth, the entire Earth. Now, I could be wrong. But that's my theory. So if it uplifted, I think that's how it happened. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. To conclude, I don't think we need to jump on Posnansky's uplift bandwagon shared by the likes of Zachariah Sitchin, that there was an altiplano uplift. The tremendous area of Lake Titicaca is itself justification for the placement of Tiahuanacu, for the eroded port facilities around Tiahuanacu. I think Posnansky may have made certain mistakes in his rainfall calculations or looking at the rainfall differences. Maybe this led him to think that the area was not suitable for farming when in fact it is. Maybe there was a famine there in the early 20th century. This has to be investigated. So that lake, clearly Titicaca, was the source of Tiwanaku's wealth and empire, and it still is. There are towns in that area. So I'm prepared to look at both 15,000 BC as well as more recent conventional dates for when humans lived there, because honestly, humans didn't just pop up in the last few thousand years. We have been around forever. And I do see great evidence of recycling rock at Tiahuanacu. It seems to me that Pumapunku is the older version of Tiahuanacu. Pumapunku was a quarry from which Tiahuanacu was built. It has a different style of rocks, a different civilization. It's not just one people over only 1,000 years. It's thousands and thousands of years of people. Thank you.